Hello, I am Rosalind Stone and I'm a psychedelic media consultant, and I co-host the Semantrix Sessions with philosopher of language Dr. Reanne Crane. The Semantrix Sessions, which are all about semantics. And so I'd like to lead into the infographic which we are bringing you today with a little story, almost a fable about semantics. And it starts in 2004 when a small grassroots gathering of people came together to talk about a very important shared interest. And then they continued to meet year on year at Sadler's Wells Theatre in London, where they hosted Break-In Convention. Break-In Convention, which was dedicated to breakdancing. Break-In Convention, which ends with an apostrophe as opposed to a G on the last word. And there was a kind of digital skirmish in around 2011 that lasted until 2013 or so, when Break-In Convention, a small grassroots gathering of researchers looking into the potential medicinal benefits of psychedelics, began to gather and began to establish a digital footprint and an identity. And these two conferences, Break-In Convention and Break-In Convention, used to vie on the internet to be the one signified by the anchor text of the name. And there's something important exemplified in this. What happens when you substitute an apostrophe for a G? You get an entirely different proposition. You get people gyrating in beautiful formations in Sadler's Wells, or you get people talking about receptors and transformation and treatment-resistant depression and ketamine for alcohol addiction at the University of Greenwich, or most recently the University of Exeter. And it's in relation to the importance of precision when it comes to semantics that we are bringing you some very important information today from quite an infamous voice on the psychedelic discourse scene, particularly when it comes to semantics. And it is none other than Darryl Bickler, who has some wisdom to share, some wisdom which Reanne Crane and I have sat down with Darryl and we have discussed for many, many hours, many years, something that feels more like many centuries, in order to bring you a digest of some very important points, which, if we all were to adopt the wisdom encoded in what you're about to listen to, there would be dramatic changes for the clarity and the significance and the import of the ways that we talk about substances and altered states and the right to experience them and the policies in which these experiences are enshrined.
If you think about what it really is, wild fungi that grow, that have been used for thousands of years, and you set that off against these divisions. So it's going to apply only to certain people, and these are victims of circumstance or illness, and that they've failed in other regards. That's making a fetish of access. And then the whole thing is medicalized, so that it has to be people who are licensed in the medical profession, as opposed to shaman, community leaders, or even just yourself walking through the park. And so rather than think about their liberty, their cognitive liberty at all, it becomes compartmentalized and sub-compartmentalized into an ever-growing control structure that doesn't really represent any political advantage. So whilst there is a positive to it, that it does allay some of the stigma in the public psyche that doctors can use it, it's not all negative. It is a kind of good publicity of a sort. You have to see it in its political terms. What is the balance of power? There is an equation in law that every criminal law is there to balance two things. It's to balance the reasonable freedom of the legal subject with protection of the public and the public interest. And what happens to that equation is that it becomes completely ruined and nullified through this idea that the object now has the agency. So once the object becomes illegal, then it's impossible to balance, and it's the balancing which is achieved through those regulatory sections. So an interesting case in Canada at the Supreme Court for the safer injection facility, Insight, was that their Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, which has two sections, 55 and 56, directly correlate to three sections that I mentioned in the Misuse of Drugs Act. And although the government were not minded to grant a license to allow Insight for its safer injection facility at downtown Eastside, Vancouver, when it got to the Supreme Court of Canada, not the Supreme Court of British Columbia, but the Supreme Court of Canada, they kind of demonstrated that the minister had a duty to fulfill the purposes of the Act by making those regulations, by granting those licenses, because failure to do so makes the Act unconstitutional, because without the duty, as I use that word deliberately, to actively regulate people, businesses, etc., not drugs, vis-a-vis drugs, then it becomes what they call unfettered discretion. And in Britain, what they've done is they've always kowtowed to the United Nations treaties, Single Convention, Narcotics, 61, and the rest of it, to say, well, our hands are tied.
What's the UN thing you mentioned there?
Right, well, the United Nations has treaties about the Single Convention on Narcotics. I think that's a 61, and they have sort of stepped up and said, right, you know, it's your job to signatories of this convention to stop all cannabis use, to stop this use of drugs. They don't even look at the misuse of alcohol, pharmaceuticals, and tobacco in that. I think they've got some separate World Health Organization documents about that. But so they claim to have their hands tied by those treaties, and I've seen even QCs kind of fail at this, is that those treaties are what they call ratified instrument, and a ratified instrument is signed by the executive of government. You can divorce from it, you know, there's always a way out. So the government are bound by it whilst they choose to be so bound, but it's not incorporated into UK law, unlike the Human Rights Act, which is incorporated into UK law. And it does not affect the courts, it does not bind Parliament, and it certainly doesn't bind the Advisory Council at all. It's something that the executive agreed to do as their policy. So for the courts to say, well, you know, we can't find any abuse of power, unreasonableness or unlawfulness or irrationality within this policy, because the UN said it is a flagrant error of law and an abdication of their duty, actually, because the whole Montesquieu idea of separation of powers is really failing. That you know, the judiciary seem to be very much government lackeys or lackeys in pharmaceutical companies, alcohol lobbies, or whatever, which is why it does require a very articulate case with some traction in the public domain. I think it always helps to have good propaganda out there, which is partly my frustration, but it's not in any way even lodged within the public psyche, what I'm saying, even though it's correct.
Where do you think that resistance comes from? Like, why do you think it's been so intractable, the uptake of these nuances?
There's almost certainly a lot of people whose interests are not magnanimous or benevolent in the sense that they're not looking, let's say, towards access to psychedelics and everything purely for the most humanitarian reasons. They see opportunity for control, opportunity for profit.
And then it comes to decide to uphold the system in which they get to do the profiting rather than a full-scale removal of all of the structures.
I don't believe there's any benevolence in the monopolization and corporatization of this whole subject. And that's because their shareholders and their success depends on your criminalization, because unless they can keep it, if somebody's going to pay £6,000 for 3 ketamine infusions in Bristol, and somebody can stand outside door saying, well, listen, for 60 quid, I'll give you 3 grams of ket, and this is how to use it. I don't think the clinic's going to do as well, particularly when to literally try to patent this idea of music, cushions and lighting, as if people rolling spliffs hadn't been doing that for like centuries anyway. So even if they synthesize psilocybin through a novel process, or they can make it, some bacteria grow it or produce it themselves, and therefore they want royalties on it, like a musician that's composed a song. Everything that is created is built on the backs of everything that went before it, a legacy from the whole of collective knowledge of humanity. If there's any argument that psychedelics and other things don't necessarily provide valuable insights, it's the fact that the psychedelic movement and all the people in it can be like running down a path for corporatization of weird politics, misused language. I became quite unpopular with a lot of them because I did become a stickler for the correct language. I found it almost an impossible task to do it without becoming the most unpopular person in the room.
I think the other thing is that culturally we live in a makeup of elevator pictures and slogans and campaigns. And what you're addressing is about the nuances that reside when you delineate very carefully how something has slipped between several different registers to become something that signifies that which it isn't. Yeah. And that's the absolute anathema of a succinct slogan. It requires so much careful delineation of several different things to set up the point. And I'm just actually curious as to whether there is an elevator pitch that it could turn into.
So you're saying that if it's not snappy, they're not happy, really?
Yes, I think that's perfect.
What we really need to excite this world and to rescue it from degradation is transformation. And we shouldn't be apologetic about that. We need transformation in politics, transformation in drug policy, transformation in interpersonal relationships. Those legal words do have real power. They're literally the censorship that restricts your possibilities of being. So possibilities is what it's all about. Dichotomy between everything is resolved as soon as we put ourselves back at the center of those equations, that we actually recognize that objects can't be legal or illegal. We're being separated from our environment and constructed by these language structures and laws. And there's a disconnect in the language. The words are saying all these things thou shalt not do, but they're not. Where did all these commandments come from? Extra commandments. The original 10 commandments might look a bit historic now, and some of them not very fashionable, but we seem to just wanting to have thousands and more legislation. And for all these changes that they're talking about, they're creating more and more legislation. It's just a raft of it, and nobody can deal with it. And the interesting thing is that it's all about trying to describe things that are like other to us. So everything is other, and that in itself is a slight problem, because you can use words to communicate, but the words are not the thing itself. So I could say, or someone could say that they love you, and you're happy with that. Oh, they love me. But all they've done is use a word, whereas the word love isn't the word. Obviously, love is something else. It's evidenced by other things than the word. Actually, it is something very different. And so our language is always grasping to explain something, which is just using these vocal or written symbols. But interestingly, sometimes it's more than that. And I know I discussed this with Ross before about the idea, or it was already said, that law is supercharged speech. And that's because the laws are not described by words. These words are not really describing the law. They are it in a more literal sense than the words of a poem are the poem, possibly, because it's not meant to be subjective. It's meant to, like a command, convey absolute certainty, and that by meddling around with the words, then you change it fundamentally. It's almost like it's chemically changed. It's gold to lead. It isn't the same thing anymore. It's now something else. they've never had a meeting about alcohol. And every time I say an object, really, I should always link it to people. So they never discuss the misuse by people of alcohol, save in regard to the possible misadventures through polydrug misuse when you mix it with tranquilizers or GHB or whatever it is.
Is
that's when there's some
implication that it's the illicitly used one's fault and not the illicitly used one?
I don't like the replacement of the word illegal with illicit either, because I also believe that when we say illicit, we're referring to a kind of behavior of people and not really an object. So, you know, I remember the campaign to ban these evil knives and all this kind of thing. So we transfer the human quality to the object. Transferred epithet is a figure of speech which shortens language to make it more amenable. So I don't say, I want to buy a stick to help me with my walking. I buy a walking stick, even though if I take it back to the shop and say, that stick is totally lazy, won't take the dog out, just sits in the corner of the hallway, people think I'm an idiot.
Always have the preposition for in it, so like it's a stick for walking, it's a toilet for the disabled. Is it always a dative?
Well, the transferred epithet actually avoids that. It's to avoid having to explain that you're going to use it. So because there is a direct equivalence in meaning, most people don't have any problem in changing this sentence. A drug which is illegal to possess without authority, exemption or license is an illegal drug. And that is a transferred epithet. As indeed is a controlled drug, which is the preferred and correct legal term. Because drugs can't be controlled, we are controlled, as in the verb to control, with respect to controlled drugs, which is adjective plus noun. I hope it's been food for thought, because I think that you ladies